Hi everyone. I'd like to introduce the panelists first of all. To my right is Sandi Tan, director of Shirkers, and to my left, Tim Wardle, director of Three Identical Strangers. I don't think the films have shown yet.
Not yet.
Nope.
Tonight.
Nope, tonight.
About now.
Would you like to say when the films are showing so people can note it down?
Mine's showing at 3:15 and then again on Tuesday at 6:30, I think.
Okay.
And mine's at 9:15 tonight with a live musical element, and then on Monday, 11th, but I don't know what time.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the films haven't screened yet, so we're going to do our best to avoid spoilers. What we'll do is we'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then I'll open it up to questions. So I'll kind of give you a while to think about what you want to ask these guys. Have you seen each other's films?
Yep.
Yes.
So what I'd like to do, just to put you on the spot and add some pressure, is ask each of you to describe the other person's film.
Oh my God.
Just briefly. So everybody kind of like has a bit of context for what we're talking about. Because it's too easy if I ask you to describe your own film.
It's not fair. It's
It's
really
not fair.
really not fair because it's both our films are rife with spoilers and we're both extremely protective of them. But I mean, I will say that I met Tim at Sundance and we both showed our films for the first time, but I didn't get to see it until like 5 festivals later, and we
Yeah, these
run
guys
into
have
each
both
other.
been doing the same festival circuit.
Yeah.
Both the films premiered at Sundance. So you've got an extremely high caliber of filmmaker. here.
No, I cannot.
You can't do it. Okay.
I cannot do it justice. I won't.
Sandi's film. It was by far and away my favourite film I saw at Sundance. It really is a wonderful film. You should definitely go and see it. I would describe it as it's kind of like Stories We Tell meets. What's the other film you referenced?
Oh, right, the one with James Franco with that horror, the one the room, that one.
Oh yeah, The Room. No.
The Disaster Artist.
The Disaster Artist. But somebody said it was in the Venn diagram between Stories We Tell and The Disaster Artist.
Yeah,
But
I think it's a much better. I think it's a much better version of Stories We Tell. That type of film, personally.
Thank you.
Do you want to have a go, Sandi?
But that's not really the description. It's it's just praise. Tim's a wonderful person. I think his film is like the most fascinating. It's about the most fascinating subject. I think has got the most fascinating subject out there. I just can't do it.
Okay, so I'll do it.
Okay.
I'll briefly outline what these two films are about, and then we'll watch a clip from both of them so you
Yes.
kind of have a context. So Shirkers is about a young woman who makes a feature film and kind of gets to the point of shooting it, and then it needs to go into sort of post-production, except the person who has all the reels of film, because it was all shot on 16mm film, just pisses off with all of the canisters of film.
And that young person happened to be me.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's a mystery about what happened to this lost film when many years later the materials are recovered. And the person, the filmmaker, is Sandi herself. In Tim's film, it's about... I'm just trying to think of a way to
Shall I do the
not spoil
non-spoiler
it.
version?
Yes,
I
you
could
should
do
do
Yeah,
it. It's
what-
so hard.
I was going to say, do you want to let me have a go? But
Okay, no, go for it. It's really hard. We spend half our time with this film trying to work out how to tell people about it without spoiling it.
It's about three
Three identical strangers.
it's about three identical strangers. It's about triplets who were separated or grew up separately, and sort of how they find their way back together, and sort of how they're similar, and then in retrospect maybe how they were different. Would you say that's a
good.
non-spoilery
That's a
version?
brilliant non-spoiler.
It's-
Thank you.
So difficult. Yeah.
It's so
Just
difficult.
amazing. I've been taking pictures of rooms because doing these things in European places, and I'm just taking pictures of ceilings. It's amazing ceilings.
It's worth saying with the story, just describing the films, when you've got a quite narrative, our films, I think, for the Sundance lot of docs that came out this year, and probably compared to a lot of the other docs playing this year, are slightly different in that they're quite narrative driven. I mean, obviously, all docs have a story of some kind, but these are really driven by both films are driven by their narratives, and that makes it, when you're talking about them, really, really, really hard to discuss. But we'll do our best.
Yeah, and also, you know, there are ways, these are two quite different films, but there are a lot of ways in which they're very similar, and so we'll be kind of drawing out some of those similarities. But I think in order for you to sort of understand where we're at, seeing as some of you, or most of you, won't have seen the films yet, let's watch Tim's first clip, so you get a sense of what the tone of this film might be, and then right after we'll run Sandi's first clip. So first, I think I'd like to ask Tim a question. I know from doing some reading around the film that you sort of came to this project quite early and were sort of involved in its development stages before you were assigned as the director. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you came to the project as opposed to how it came to you.
So my background is, I'm like a development guy. So I work for production companies. I used to run docs development for the BBC, but I've worked for various production companies running development teams. And my job is generally to sift through hundreds of ideas, you know, proposed by internal teams, and also people bring them in from outside and sort of work out which ones are worth pitching to the BBC or Channel 4 or wherever to make. And when you do that job, your tolerance for kind of good ideas is quite, there's a very high bar to impress you. But when this story was brought in, it was brought in by an external producer called Grace Hughes Hallett. Instantly, she had the bare bones of the story, but instantly it was like, this is the single best narrative I've ever heard, and I have to make this film. And it took us about 2 years, 3 years to develop. No, actually, Grace and I spent 2 years, and then another 2 years in pre-production. So 5 years in total to get the film made.
And would you say that's kind of your usual route into filmmaking, an idea kind of coming at you in that way, or did this differ from what you're used to? I mean, look, I've been coming to Sheffield for like 15 years. Most of the time, it's really surreal being here because I'm used to being in the audience, watching people talk rubbish on stage and thinking I know better than them and telling all my friends that I could do better than them. And now I'm here, it's a bit scary. But I think there are different routes in. I chose to go that development route, and I have made other films. I made a few films for Channel 4. And what I like about development is it's very creative. You know, even at a junior level, you can be really creative because you can pitch ideas, and you go through a lot of ideas very quickly. You don't get stuck with one project. And the wonderful thing about being a director who also does development is you can sit there and bide your time and wait for the right project to do. So you don't have to be a jobbing director going from, you know, project to project just to pay the bills kind of thing, which I don't think I could ever do. I guess it's an unusual way to come to a project, but as it was being developed, I just got more and more attached to it. You know, I think originally everyone wanted big name directors, all kinds of like A-list director names were mentioned. I just sort of biding my time, working on it, developing it, and you get to a point where no one can get rid of you because you're so kind of integral to the project, and that's kind of what happened. It's kind of sneaky, I guess. Sandi, obviously your film is different because it's autobiographical, it's your life. So maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about making a film about yourself and what it was like from kind of going to, so for a bit of context, Sandi also has written a novel which is not about you, it's about a fictional character. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what it's like to make a film about yourself when this is sort of your, I guess, feature debut, unless we're counting Shirkers itself.
Yeah, so this was, I was a teenager when I wrote Shirkers in Singapore. When I was there, I was this teenage film nerd in Singapore where there weren't many female teenage film nerds. And I was also a prolific bootlegger of films on VHS, amassing a huge collection of, you know, Coen Brothers and Jarmusch and people like that, and felt very, very alone. And basically what happened was I went to the first, me and two friends, we were all 18, and we, after high school, we went to the first filmmaking course ever in Singapore, and it was run by this very enigmatic man who said he was American and who said he was 40-ish. His name was George Cardona, and and he was the mentor and became my teacher and kind of opened up my world into, made filmmaking sort of a possibility in my mind, and not just writing about films and dreaming about them and being this crazy teenager. Anyway, so how did I make this film? It's
more like what was it like to make a film about yourself?
Yeah. So having, like 20 years later, when these, it was, okay, I'll do a spoiler now because it's impossible to talk about this without doing the spoiler. I made this film, and then it was stolen. We shot the whole thing, and it was, obviously, we shot this thing. And before it was put together, it was stolen from us and was vanished for 20 years into a black hole. And it was in 2011 that it was, when I was beginning my new life as a novelist in LA with my new novel that was about to come out, that I received this communication from somebody from the past, and this 7 boxes of 16 millimeter totaling 700 minutes and slides and all these shards from my past, like a monster Pandora's box was actually 7 Pandora's boxes were sent to my house, and I had to get involved in this thing. So this was 20 years of me doing that. And what was your question again? How did I get into making this film?
I guess,
there was no
I guess
choice.
I'm trying to draw out
Yeah.
the differences in the kind of films you make, because Tim has made a film about sort of people who he didn't have a previous connection to, but obviously
Yeah.
you're using documentary in a different way because this is a film about you and your
Yeah,
life.
and it became this project for me to kind of solve this gigantic jigsaw puzzle, this to explain this black hole in my life, and it became like me becoming a detective, trying to solve what happened to the lost years of my life, this 20-year gap, this huge hole of missing information, and solving, a lot of, it was like, 20, and it was 25 years after this film happened that I managed to make the Shirkers last year. So it was 1992 that I did the original Shirkers, and then I did the kind of remake of a film that was never actually made in 2017. So that's 25 years, and like watching, I was saying to you that I was watching the 3rd season of Twin Peaks, David Lynch's Twin Peaks, and that was 25 years after Fire Walk with Me as well, and it was like Laura Palmer coming back to life to solve her own murder again, and I felt like Laura Palmer coming to solve the mystery of my life, and I saw myself as a detective of this black hole in my life, and it was the process. My film is kind of the process of me solving that mystery and at the same time having a dialogue across the chasm with my nemesis George Cardona, and so it's kind of a Sherlock Moriarty kind of conversation, I guess,
I
a
think
quarrel through the years.
Maybe this would be a good opportunity to show Sandi's second clip, which is about George, so you can kind of get a bit of a sense of him. So let's have Sandi's second clip. So the reason why I wanted to show those 2 clips next to each other is because I think one thing that both of these films have in common is that they're both mysteries. And so maybe each of you could kind of talk a little bit about how, as filmmakers, you kind of engineer a structure that still has tension and mystery and kind of as much propulsive energy as a narrative feature might have.
I mean, I think one of the things that our films have in common is that they're a mix of 2, I mean, you may see it differently, Sandi, but 2 kind of what I see as quite different documentary styles. One is the kind of present tense, actuality, kind of in the moment sort of filmmaking, and the other is a sort of past tense, retelling of what went on in the past. And they're quite different types of filmmaking. Past tense stuff, because you know the story to a greater or lesser degree, you can really craft it and get it cut quite tightly, and you can plot it almost like a Hollywood thriller or something. Whereas the present tense stuff, the actuality footage, just has a different energy. It's not cut as tight. You're in rooms, you don't know exactly what's going to happen. You're filming the camera. They're just they've got a bit more fat on them, and getting those two to work together is actually quite a challenge. In terms of the sort of mystery thing, I mean, I think that both of us, or certainly what I try to do is, you know, selectively you withhold information, but you don't want to feel like you're doing that just to manipulate the audience for the sake of it. In my film, it's restricting the perspective and the flow of information really to what the brothers had as they were discovering that there's one, then there's two, then there's three of them, and the following revelations that there are in the story.
What about you, Sandi?
I have to say I'm really drawn to stories that have a good beginning and middle and but not necessarily in that order. I most of all, I think, drawn to stories that have high, intense emotional truth to them. And I feel like in making this film, I had to really get myself into the headspace of how I was when I was a teenager, trying to make Shirkers the first time around. And I had to go and, you know, kind of dive into my archive and read all my crazy letters. I would write like 3 letters a day to my friends rather than keeping a diary, because I need an audience on the other side. And you know, like just to get myself kind of as a method filmmaker into that headspace before I could even dive into the film. And how I did this, how we worked on this documentary, me and my editor Lucas, we sat next to each other and just worked for, you know, maybe 9 months solving this mystery, but going at it backwards, which is, we started from, I mean, which was important to me, emotions first and capturing feelings. And I think that, you know, if you have the right, like, emotions can be a great, a different kind of narrative driver that you can kind of, you know, take people along with you through a story and a mystery in kind of new and unexpected ways, rather than just the traditional, you know, beginning, middle, and end. If you can capture a certain level of high emotional truth and intensity, I think you can take people to unexpected places and tell stories in a different way, which is what we did. We started with graphics and music first, mood and feeling, before we started defining the story. I kind of knew what I wanted to do, and I worked with I shall say, gloriously inexperienced editor, Lucas, which is great because this is completely in the spirit of how we did Shirkers in the first place. Like 18-year-olds who didn't know anything and just dived into it. And you know, I made zines and stuff when I was a teenager as well. So Lucas was a skateboarder from Chicago who didn't have any editing credits to his name, and I couldn't afford to hire somebody with, you know, I horrified all my great friends who I love who are pro editors, you know, of great movies, and that we were going to start with mood and feeling first before we started to feel and find the story. And they thought it was completely opposite, because they would usually, as you all know, would work on the story first. They would run away with all the footage and then watch it and, you know, conjure up a story, and then send all the graphics away to be done. Because we have, you know, it's not in the clips that we showed, but a lot of flying graphics in this film, and send that out to somebody for, you know, expensive graphics experts to come up with it. And we did that first, and we did music and feeling first, and then we found the story together.
I think what's interesting about what you've both said is that you're kind of saying the same thing, that the way these kind of mystery structures were created was kind of through trying to understand the way things unfolded through the protagonist's eyes. And in Tim's case, it was the 3 brothers, and in Sandi's case, it was you.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I want to talk to you both about access and kind of gaining the trust of the people that you talk to, because you're both coming from quite different perspectives. Tim, obviously, you had to build relationships with this group of people, this family and their friends, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Whereas Sandi, you were going back to relationships with people that you'd known for many, many years, and maybe you was close to some of them still, and others you had drifted apart from. So the dynamics are quite different. So maybe you can both speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I mean, getting the main contributors on board my film was the single greatest challenge to getting it off the ground. When you see the film, they've experienced some pretty horrific things in their lives, and earning their trust is not something that's done easily. And even when we were making the film, I kept on expecting a phone call saying we're not doing this anymore the whole way through. So that took a long time. And I think just to echo what Sandi was talking about, you know, what you're looking at from documentaries are only good as their contributors. or subjects as they call them in America, and you're looking for emotional honesty. That's what you need. What these films both have is a strong narrative at their heart, which I really like, because I think a lot of documentary films, you see a kind of issue-driven looking for a narrative rather than narrative and issue together, working together. And Sandi's absolutely right. I agree with her that it's not enough for a film just to have narrative. It could be a thrilling technical exercise, but it needs to have heart, and it needs to have a bigger theme that it's speaking to. And so we worked really, really hard at that when we were making the film. You need the combination of contributors, emotional honesty, and it's got to speak to something bigger and more universal. Otherwise, it's just going to feel like a niche little thing that should be on TV or whatever.
This is about finding the subjects, and so we didn't have any.
About gaining the trust of the people that you're speaking to.
Yeah.
Knowing them beforehand and whether that complicated things.
Yeah. So this being a personal film, all of these subjects I kind of knew personally. You didn't see any of them in the clips, but I talked to a bunch of people, and I was kind of like the link in this whole mystery between all of them, and most of them have never met and don't know each other, and then when they saw the film, the whole thing got explained. And some of them were my friends, so two of them were Jasmine and Sophie that I made Shirkers with back in '92, and I feel like I'm a terrible, terrible friend and a horrible friend, and I actually kind of needed the making of this Shirkers this time around as an excuse to reach out to these people I've lost touch with, and all these feelings of teenage when the first Shirkers failed, feelings of betrayal and things like that. I felt like I used the making of this film as the excuse to kind of reach out to them again and to talk about this trauma that we all experienced together with this film as an intermediary. And, that's how I managed to get them to be so open and frank.
I was going to say, one of my favourite things about your film is there's an examination of female friendship at its heart, which I genuinely haven't seen, certainly not rendered like it is in your. It's just so honest and kind of, you're so brutal with each other.
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
It's pretty raw. I mean, we didn't have any of the clips here, but it's I just felt it was very important to it's like a lot of women have seen this film, and they told me that they all have a friend who's like that, who's like a sister, and you just argue for
Sandi's
25 years.
To one of the characters in the film called Jasmine, I think.
Yeah, and who's here and hopefully not in this room. But she's going to be here tonight and yelling at me on stage again, as she does, entertainingly. But it's a truthful relationship. She still accuses me of things that aren't true. She blames me for the failure of Shirkers and stuff, and we have this ongoing quarrel for 25 years. And that's a lot of people have that friendship. A lot of women have that kind of friend, and I honestly haven't seen that caught as well, and I always wonder why. And so I decided to do that and kind of ambush my friends and get them to talk about this thing. And in fact, it was my excuse to talk about this thing again. Making this film was my excuse to reconnect with these friends.
I mean, I guess I'm interested to know a little bit more kind of specifically about how you managed to convince someone that you're not going to misrepresent them. I think that might be useful for any kind of filmmakers in the audience who are looking to learn more about how to engage with subjects.
It's really hard. I mean, it's the single biggest challenge in being a good documentary filmmaker is earning the trust of your contributors. And partly it's, I think, instinctual. If whether people warm to you. I think also in my case, being a Brit helped. I think if I'd been American, I think they would have been more defensive. I think you're sort of a bit of a curiosity as an outsider, and I think being an outsider can often help. Sometimes as a documentary maker, you go into, I've been definitely in environments and filming with people or prisons and stuff like that, and you think, oh God, are people going to judge me because they think I'm middle class or whatever? And actually, the more different you are to the people you're filming, sometimes it's the best, because you can just ask really dumb things from the point of view of total ignorance. But I think spending time with people, and I think being honest with them right from the outset. If you are just trying to say everything's going to be wonderful and you're going to love this film, it's going to be brilliant, you're on really dodgy territory. And actually what people appreciate is if right at the start, and I learnt this from various companies I worked at doing access meetings with big companies and things like that, right at the start you go in, you say, look, we think, you know, we're going to make a good, honest film that's factually accurate, but there are going to be moments when you're going to think, why did we let the cameras in? Why did we let these people film us? I wish we wouldn't do that. And if you're honest about that up front, people can see you're not trying to sort of con them into something. So I think that's really important. Just time, face time with people and their families is really important without cameras. You know, that's where, when I see people say, oh, you know, we're making a documentary for such and such a online thing in 5 days or whatever, I think, God, that's going to be hard. You know, you need to spend time and invest time without filming as much as possible. It will pay off tenfold when you actually pick up a camera and start filming.
But also you have really good vibes. I mean, you just seem like such a good person that everyone would just want to talk to you. And I actually played on my evil vibes, I think, with my subjects, especially with my friends that I have contentious relationships with. It just helps to carry that over if you want to capture something real in your relationship and just all the tension that is there. You're just yourself. But I have those characters, and then I have new characters who are new to this Shirkers story, as this detective journey continues, who are relevant to the story later on, and then the movie changes into more of a kind of a detective story, and these people actually I don't have any relationship with, long-time relationship with. I just met them in the solving of this movie, and those people were just great people who just wanted to talk and tell me all about George because they knew him in the past, and we all were bonded by the love of stories, I think, and the love of wanting to solve this mystery together. So that was one way we could do that. But mainly, whereas you invested, or you actually are a person full of good vibes and benefited from that. Some of my subjects didn't see me that way, and I benefited from that. So that was great.
I mean, sort of slightly related to that, Sandi. Obviously, you're in the film, you narrate the film, then there's you in Shirkers when you were much younger. And I wonder, when you were editing the film and piecing it together, how much you sort of saw yourself as a character in the film, and how you were able to kind of create a character in order to kind of tell the story rather than just it being a direct or accurate representation of you, but one that sort of you were able to use for dramatic effect.
It was self-horror. I mean, first of all, it was just getting over seeing myself. For the longest time, I just didn't want to open those horrible boxes and see myself as this awkward teenager, giving this zombie-ish performance. And for the longest time, they were just the stack of radioactive boxes in my house. I just did not want to touch. And then finally, when I saw them and I knew how to do it, I had to put myself aside, the vanity thing aside, because there were other people in the film that were giving such amazing performances, and the production design was amazing, and I realized it's not about me. And I began to separate myself from it. And as I was making this film, and I narrate this thing, and there's also present day footage of me. I began, as I was editing this film, I began to see it as the filmmaker Sandi as separate from old young Sandi and bad line reading Sandi and all these other people who were just they were just tools for me to make a story with, and I just could somehow compartmentalize because I'm that way, and the different versions of me into things on the computer, and me and Lucas would just come and deal with those as tools and criticize that version of me as a tool, and so that made it a lot easier, I think. Was that your question?
Yes.
It's worth saying that the amazing thing about Sandi's film is just how honest it is. You're author of not just the narrative of the film, but it's almost like a semi-biography of a part of your life. And it would be so easy to not be as unsparing and as honest as you are. Like the first film I ever made was for Channel 4 for the first cut, and I'm in it, a bit like you. It's not as personal. Yeah. And it's terrifying, because you have to watch the sort of performance as well as the footage you've shot, which is normally not as good as you wanted. And actually, I had someone come up to me recently and say, at a party, and say, "Oh, I'm really sorry that your presenting career didn't take off." And I was what? And they said, "Oh, well, you were in that film for Channel." I didn't want to. I got forced into it. But it is, putting yourself out there in front of camera is just
Yeah,
a
because
big
you
thing.
know, because when I first started doing this, putting this film together, I was so resistant to being in it, and I just thought it would be about making Shirkers. It would be all these other people but me. I mean, there might be footage of me. You know, maybe you can try to avoid showing me as a horrible teenager giving a horrible performance, but it'll be about everybody else. And then I was going out to do these interviews and shooting the verite from today's. For the present day sequences with Iris Ng, who also shot Stories We Tell. She's my DP, and she had, she was kind of like had a hunch because she had shot Stories We Tell with Sarah Polley, where she had done the same thing of shooting Sarah when she wasn't quite aware and thinking that maybe that might be needed later on when you put this film together. She did that with me too, secretly filming me, and I wound up having to use almost everything that she shot because I was so resistant to being on camera, so resistant to all of this that I was so thankful for her when I realized editing this that it has, I have to be in it, that there was some footage of me.
Let's open it out to questions from the audience. There's a roving mic, so stick your hand up and then we'll come to you. Don't be shy. Yes, there's one person at the back here. You should just wait for the mic.
Hi. You were speaking a bit about being sensitive and taking your time, Tim, when approaching people for access. I was wondering if you had any sort of thoughts or tips about that kind of sensitivity when it comes to production, like quite mechanically, physically. What do you think works in terms of getting good performances out of people in those kinds of sensitive environments?
It's a really good question. I think if you're fortunate enough to be working in a team, I had a good producer who was kind of maintaining the relationships. I used to kill myself. Shooting kind of verite films like the prison one I mentioned. I was in there with a camera, kind of on my own filming, and actually having a team that you can kind of delegate stuff to a bit allows you to kind of sit back from it and make sure that contributors are kind of looked after, but you're not having to kind of hold their hand the whole way through. I think it's also just being sensitive to when you're asking them questions. I had to ask people about very, very dark, troubling stuff, mental health, suicide, issues like that. And, you have to be mindful of where you leave people. If you're spending a day interviewing people, at the end of it, you don't end on that material. You ask them that sort of halfway through, and then you come out on something nice and fluffy or something they're happy talking about, even if you're not going to use it in the film. That's my approach, because you have just enormous responsibility and power as a filmmaker. It doesn't matter if you've got a huge crew or there's just you and a camera. If you've got a camera and you're pointing it at someone, you have a huge amount of power and responsibility, and it's really important to be aware of that. I mean, look, I'm not averse to also, to get good performance. I interviewed the guys for a day each, the two main contributors in my film, and I sat them on quite an uncomfortable chair on purpose so they wouldn't slump, because you get people, they just slump after a couple of hours filming, and they were constantly shifting like this. And the sound man kept saying to me, "Oh, look, they're moving, it's rustling." I'm like, no, leave it, because you need to be aware of those kind of techniques to keep people engaged. Otherwise, if you get people who have that sort of slump post-lunch, you're not going to get the material you need. So it's a balance of what you need, but also being mindful to them and their needs.
Other questions? Yes, over here.
Hi, I have a question for Sandi. I'm also working for an autobiographical documentary, and I just tried to see yours today. When you write about your past, how you get into the mood more exactly, if you can, and after that, how you choose the special moments, because when you write about your many years life, it's a lot of pages, and you need only 90 minutes to make the movie.
Yeah. So how do I get into that headspace was, watching the archival video that was so fuzzy on here, and reading all my letters, and just remembering what it was like to be a teenager at that point, and the anger I felt when this film was stolen from me. So it was basically a very, I was just a crazy person for a few months of editing, especially in the beginning, just really intense, just really reliving that every single day. And luckily, I'm not uncomfortable with writing because I'm a novelist as well, and I'm used to writing. So what I did with the VO was I would just, think of it as a scratch track. These are all temporary things. You can talk into a mic at home and just like keep working through various VOs. Like I did like 10, different versions for each line and kept changing things around. And you can, I made this film in my garage. So every day I could just go and play with it and change things around and try things out, and see what works best. And I had so many things about this. I mean, like so much information and so much interesting information about George. And that eventually George was threatening to, the story of George was going to like hijack the film all over again. Like he stole the film once and he was going to steal it again with how interesting he was. So I knew I had to bring it back to me and my friends and the story and make it about the dialogue that I had with George rather than about George or myself. And so when you kind of start molding the story and see what was the most interesting elements of the, you start to shape it, and then you will find 90 minutes that are the best 90 minutes for the best dramatic storytelling that you can do. So that will just happen naturally, I think. But for me, it was emotional truth. I think that's the thing that I believe in, that if you can keep that level of emotional truth, that's going to lead you to what's right and what's necessary, and all the fluff, will just fall away.
Yeah, question here, if you just wait for the mic.
It's about the what attracted you to the stories in the first place, the story choices. I mean, Sandi, obviously it was your life, and you've talked a bit about it, but what specifically made you initially think, well, this would be, what's the emotional core that you were attracted to exploring, and the same with your film, that it's like incredibly dramatic. I mean, anybody would be interested, but what emotionally did you think? Oh, I'm really myself interested in this story.
So if you could both pinpoint the emotion that made you choose these projects.
For me, it was, I lived this story for 25 years, so it was solving this mystery of my life and where all the years went and why I was such a loser for a long time of, like just not doing anything, and how this big chasm in my life had to be, I had to account for all the missing years. And I was so angry with the lost time that it was me kind of fighting against lost time. And that was the impetus for me to make this film, was an exercise in kind of, what cinema is, which is bending time and space to solve this mystery and to involve these other people and kind of speaking for them as well and giving them their voices back. Because as soon as I saw the footage and how amazing it was, my jaw dropped. It was like, I felt like for the longest time I could not speak about this. I felt like a liar, or nobody would believe me anyway if I described what Shirkers was, and that we did this film in 1992 when nobody was making films. And to actually have that and as proof, I knew I had to tell the story.
It sounds like the emotion that you were seeking there was justice.
Well, it was justice for everybody else, but for me, it was, accounting for suddenly being old and not having done very much or something, and then having to explain myself to myself.
What about you, Tim?
I think it's actually tricky to articulate sometimes why stories appeal to you. I mean, aside from it being a great story, and I think that the further I've got into my career, I just trust instinctually, I know which stories I have to tell, and this one immediately I did. I mean, obviously, it's a fantastic story, and weirdly, people talk about duty of care to contributors, which absolutely I believe in is number one priority when you make a film, but weirdly, I feel a duty of care to the story. I just knew it was a great story, and it had to be told the right way, and I felt that I was able to do that. I think the other thing is that there were bigger themes beyond this incredible personal narrative of these brothers separated and reunited. There's a big debate about nature nurture in the film, and about free will and destiny and family, and those are big meaty themes that I'm interested in and care about. I studied psychology at university. It just ticked my boxes on so many levels. I didn't even rationalize it. I just knew that I had to make it.
And actually, I just want to add, I also wanted to have this film speak to a lot of young people wanting to make things, and for them to be brave, and just like, what could be the worst thing that could happen to you? Your work could be stolen from you. But, just go on and do it.
There's a question, the guy in the black T-shirt, if you just wait for a microphone.
Thank you. You talked about researching and getting to know people and winning their trust and so on. But isn't there the danger there sometimes that having won their trust, they say amazing things when you're talking to them, setting up your film, which you never quite get back when you're shooting it like a month later? And there's also the possibility of maybe shooting those interviews in the beginning and putting something in writing if they don't commit to the film, that they can have the material back or you'll destroy it or whatever. That kind of question is one which I think is a real one. And also it feeds into the question of that when you start editing, those people that you've built that rapport with become text for you to edit. And they feel removed, and in some cases there is mistrust anyway, even when it comes to things like you'll make some money from the film, but I won't. Those kind of questions. It's a lot of questions, sorry.
To consolidate that,
Yeah.
perhaps maybe you can take this one, Tim. How do you sort of gain people's trust, but without getting them to reveal all the good stuff straight away, and making sure you're able to kind of create the conditions to capture that? And then I guess the other question is sort of how do you kind of reckon with the ethics of it all?
Sure. So winning people's trust, I see as a separate thing to getting their story. You know, with these guys, quite a bit of their story was known, but my producer Becky had very, very detailed conversations with them, which she'd feed back to me, but I wouldn't have those conversations with them myself. So I felt that I could have them honestly, you know, asking them the first time, and generally they would hit most of the things that she told me that they would talk about, which was really helpful. In terms of, you know, the relationship with your contributors, you know, you have to have editorial control, you know, and if you work for any organisation like the BBC, you're making the film for the BBC or Channel 4 or Netflix or whoever, they will insist on the filmmaker retaining editorial control, and you need to be 100% explicit with people about that at the top. You don't want to get into kind of murky, I'll show you a bit of footage, see what you think about that. That's a really dangerous area. You know, you have to be explicit about the relationship. And then it's just down to your ethics as a person and as a filmmaker. You know, you're right, you have huge power and responsibility. And sometimes I do think that documentary makers take that really, really lightly. I mean, I try it every single day. And actually, having been on camera myself, and as Sandi has, it makes you even more aware of that. But of course, you can totally misrepresent people. You know, I've been fortunate that, touch wood, in all the films I've made, I haven't yet had someone really object to their portrayal, but there is always a chance of that, because how people see themselves and how you see them may be completely different things. I think all you can do is try and be honest about the film you're trying to make the whole way through. When I showed this film to the contributors, I was still nervous. I'd been honest with them about what the film was going to be like, but I had no idea how they were going to react. So you just have to... if you see the film, you'll see there's the question about filmmaker ethics is reflected in a larger ethical question that plays out in the film. But it's really important to be mindful of.
Other questions? Yeah, at the back in the grey top. Yes, blonde hair. Yes. This girl, yeah.
Sorry, you said grey top, so that's what got me.
Oh, is it not grey?
No, but that's okay.
Sorry. Wow, I did have my glasses
That's
on,
all right. I'm
great.
just interested, obviously a huge part of telling the story is through the filming of it, but obviously another massive part is when you get into the edit. And I'm interested for both of you if you felt your story changed in any way when you then got into the edit, and any challenges you faced there.
I mean, this could be a huge question, so maybe if you can both take it briefly.
Yeah.
The challenges of the edit.
Yeah, you know, like I was actively in the 9-month edit, 10 months actually, solving it as I went along. And I actually, you know, briefly I worked first for 9 months with Lucas Seller, the young kid skateboarder guy who was great with moving things around, but he just was very troubled by certain aspects of my story that would make me less likable. And being a young male, there were certain kind of more personal, female-driven sides of the story that he was not so comfortable with. So at the end, my finishing editor was a woman who was older and more mature and could deal with that. And so we tackled those aspects, the more personal, the kind of darker dance between me and George aspects with this editor as we went along. And then also during the edit, I worked a lot with, and that also changed the way I told the story. Sound design was very important in my film, and I worked really closely with my sound designer, and as well as the composer who lived in Israel, and we were working on Skype. And so that, as we worked the story, because it's kind of a sonic and musical story as well, that was very important, and that kind of was all moving at the same time, and me shifting the VO and the writing as well. So all of it was moving in at one go.
I think the best thing about being a documentary maker is that the edit is really creative. You know, when you speak to drama directors, they kind of get what they've shot, and that's, you know, you can play around with it a bit, but it's much more limited. Whereas films really come to life, documentaries in the edit. We didn't have that long. I mean, we had 18 weeks, which sounds like a long time to edit, but I was speaking to Asif Kapadia, someone who works with Asif Kapadia the other day, and he takes a year to cut most of his films. And so we did have quite a lot of planning that had gone into what we were trying to do. But also, I mean, our film was filmed over the course of a year, and things would happen and people would come on board and talk to us that we thought wouldn't. And so it would shift a lot. And actually, the whole nature-nurture debate, which is at the heart of the film, we would swing backwards and forwards as we were making the film. Was we'd interview one person and we'd go, oh, that's totally changed. Maybe we haven't got free will and our destiny is determined by our genes. And then we'd speak to someone else, and you would sort of bounce back and forwards. But short answer is, yes, we did. Yes, it did come together in the edit, and we did change it, but not as much as on verite actuality films, where you make the entire film in there.
We've got time for maybe 2 more, so let's take this one at the front.
Hello. It was just a question for Sandi about how you decided to take it on, because you weren't a film. You hadn't been a filmmaker, it sounds like, for a long time since making the first film, and then it sounds like it was a very personal project. So, at what point did it become something that you were was going to be something big, and you were going to apply for funding, or was it just unfunded for quite a while?
I guess I was always a filmmaker in my head, and which actually is the most important point, that you're a filmmaker in the head. So I went about this bravely in that way. and I actually did make films in the interim. After Shirkers failed, I did make a couple short films, which actually played at Clermont-Ferrand and New York Film Festival and places like that. So I actually did make films, just not for a very long time before I tackled Shirkers. So this time round, and I had kind of moved myself away from that and kind of just mended my broken heart that way. But this was so compelling when I opened those boxes and saw that every one of those reels was intact, because George, that's a spoiler I gave away there. The film was completely intact. 25 years later, they looked like they were shot yesterday. And when I took them to this lab in Burbank, California, that actually does a lot of the digitizing of Criterion discs, because nobody knows what to do with 16 anymore, so I had to find a place that did. And I went to a place that did the Douglas Sirk movies and Grand Budapest Hotel, so they knew about color. And when they saw the footage, we digitized this, and I was watching it with the colorist, and his jaw dropped. And the whole time he was going, wow. Like, he couldn't believe that this was shot 25 years ago in a place where nobody was making this kind of stuff. And I realized it wasn't just me then thinking, wow. It was the stranger who had no relation with the film, and nothing at stake, and just was kind of awed by the images he saw, just as images. And I thought I had to do something about this. It wasn't just about me. I had to take my own vanity aside and just tell the story on behalf of everybody else whose creative endeavor and bravery and foolishness was taken away from them with this whole theft of the film. And that's when I decided to get involved in this. And then it was a process of me, going to shoot this thing with Iris, and getting some footage together, and then I sent it to Sundance, and November 2015 or something, and I immediately got this development grant from them, from the documentary fund, and then they put me in the fellows program, and then they sent me to Sundance next year to pitch this project, and I got the Genesis, BritDoc Genesis fund for innovative docs, and other people.
it's
Yeah,
quite
so
a-
it became this thing that people got involved in besides me. Yeah.
That was such an impressively speedy walk through the funding history of the film. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for, and there is another session next, so we're going to have to wrap it there. But please join me in thanking Tim and Sandi.
Thanks for coming.